Soon, the stories of Holocaust survivors will be told only through the pages of a book. But one Venice man still remembers his harrowing fight to stay out of Nazi hands, and he was willing to share it with us. Peter Konstam's story begins with his childhood babysitter, the girl who wrote the world's most famous diary, Anne Frank. A living piece of world history, Konstam sat down with our own Jim Spiewak, who joins me now with more.
Well, Mia, few can say that they survived the Holocaust. Even fewer could say they were neighbors with the famous Anne Frank, but Venice resident Peter Konstam can. Here is part one of an SNN Local News 6 exclusive, Peter Konstam's story of fleeing the Nazi invasion. At 6 years old, the last thing Peter Konstam thought he would ever do is write a book titled A Chance to Live. During prosperous times in Amsterdam, Peter had a neighbor and babysitter who loved to write, the now famous Anne Frank.
So my mother and Anna hit it off and asked Anna to take care of me. So during the afternoons, she would pick me up from school, she would take me to this park.
The relationship was strong between the Konstams and Franks. In fact, it was an idea from Peter's mother that became known years later as a piece of world history.
And one day, Edith was complaining about Anna leaving all the papers in the apartment, and then it bothered her. So my mother suggested to Edith, why don't you buy her a diary? Which then became, years later, the famous Diary of Anne Frank.
But the good times didn't last long. Both the Franks and Konstams knew Nazi forces were closing in.
There was a discussion that Otto Frank had in his house, apartment, about us joining them in the hiding place. And there were many reasons why my parents, after thinking about it and discussing it, decided that that would not be a good idea.
Living in persecution from Nazi Germany in the early 1940s, his family had no choice but to flee their home. Konstam's journey began with an ultimatum from his grandmother.
If we didn't leave, rather, she would put on the gas and blow up the apartment.
With little money, the Konstams left Amsterdam on foot and headed for Maastricht. The second night was spent in a vacant German torture shack with 3 others from the underground movement.
In one room, which was all bloodied up, dirty, smelly, with hair and hoof and you name it, and then we didn't have any clothes. We had what we were wearing.
For the next 3 weeks, they continued on foot from the northern region of Belgium to Paris. Peter remembers crossing the Cher River, heavily patrolled on both sides, with deadly German guard dogs.
The luck that we had was that there were some people that had just been killed, so the dogs were not that hungry.
In the Konstams' journey to freedom, they had to rely on others to help them cross borders, and it was difficult to know who you could trust.
There was always a big problem. How we crossed it, when we crossed it, could you trust those who were passing you or not, who wanted cash in advance or jewelry, and you never knew if they were going to betray you or be there when they were supposed to.
Now we'll finish part 2 of this series tomorrow, and me, and speaking with him as much as I did, he remembered so much in great detail, which was pretty amazing.
Yeah.
And it also is quite an honor that we have him right here in our own backyard.